Black waitress girl's seat stolen by Japanese passenger. 5 minutes later, flight gets grounded. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," Amara Johnson said firmly, her voice clear and steady as she held out her first-class boarding pass. The Japanese businessman didn't even bother to look up from the bright screen of his phone. "No, little girl," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand in her direction. "You must be confused. This is my seat." A ripple of hushed gasps spread through the nearby rows as Amara's eyes narrowed. What happened next would ground a flight before it ever left the runway, expose an ugly prejudice at 30,000 feet, and prove that sometimes the person you underestimate has more allies than you could ever imagine. This 12-year-old girl was about to teach an entire airplane a lesson about respect, dignity, and the dangerous assumption that appearances tell you everything about someone's worth. 12-year-old Amara Johnson walked down the jet bridge toward Flight 724 with the quiet, focused confidence of someone on the most important journey of her life. At 4'11", with her natural hair styled in intricate braids, she moved with a determined grace that came from years of balancing school, science fairs, and helping her mother after long shifts. Her clothes were simple but neat, a pressed blouse and clean slacks, the best outfit she owned. It spoke not of wealth, but of pride and care. This was her first time ever on an airplane, let alone in first class. This trip, this seat, was a prize she had earned through tireless work, a full scholarship to attend the National Young Innovators Conference, an honor awarded to only 20 students in the entire country. Flying wasn't a luxury for Amara, it was a miracle. Her mother, a waitress who worked double shifts 6 days a week, had raised her with two core beliefs, that her mind was her greatest asset, and that no one could ever take away her dignity. To look at Amara, most people just saw a little black girl traveling alone. And unfortunately, that was exactly how the man in seat 2A saw her. She approached row 2 and her heart sank slightly. A middle-aged Japanese businessman had spread himself across her window seat, his belongings spilling onto the adjacent one. His expensive suit was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his general demeanor suggested a profound intolerance for any disruption to his world. He was typing furiously on a tablet, his face a mask of intense concentration, completely oblivious to the fact he was occupying someone else's assigned seat. "Excuse me," Amara said politely, her voice carrying the clear enunciation her mother had always insisted upon. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." She held out her boarding pass, which clearly showed seat 2A printed alongside her name, Miss A. Johnson. The ticket was crisp, a symbol of her hard-won achievement. Any reasonable person would have glanced at it, offered a brief apology for the mix-up, and moved. But this man wasn't reasonable. He glanced up from his tablet, his expression one of pure irritation, as if a fly were buzzing in his ear. His eyes scanned Amara from head to toe, young, black, female, dressed in simple clothes, and his brain immediately processed her as someone who could not possibly belong in first class. Without even looking at her boarding pass, he waved her away. "No, little girl," he said, his tone condescending. "You are confused. This is my seat. Your section is toward the back." He gestured vaguely toward the rear of the plane with the casual arrogance of a man who had never had his authority questioned. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Several passengers nearby paused, sensing the beginning of an ugly confrontation. A woman across the aisle frowned, her brow furrowed in concern. A young man in the row behind them subtly angled his phone, sensing this was a moment that needed to be documented. Amara felt the familiar sting of being judged on sight, but she channeled her mother's voice in her head, "Hold your head high. You earned your place." "Sir," she said calmly, her voice unwavering despite the insult. "I'm not confused. This is seat 2A, and this is my boarding pass for seat 2A. You are in my assigned seat." She held the boarding pass closer, but he refused to even glance at it. Instead, he let out a short, sharp laugh, as if the idea of this girl holding a legitimate first-class ticket was the most absurd thing he had ever encountered. "Listen," he said, adopting a tone of mock patience. "I do not know what game you are playing, but children do not belong in first class alone. Your mother is probably looking for you. Go find her before you cause trouble. The condescension was layered with prejudice. He had assumed she was lost, that she couldn't afford the ticket, and that her presence in his vicinity was an anomaly that needed correcting. Each assumption was wrong, but his certainty had blinded him to the truth right in front of him. Other passengers were now staring openly. The woman across the aisle looked visibly upset. An elderly couple in the front row had stopped their quiet conversation to watch. A businessman was shaking his head slowly, a look of disgust on his face. Amara remained standing in the aisle, her boarding pass still extended, her composure a silent testament to her mother's teachings. She knew that true strength wasn't about shouting, it was about standing your ground when you knew you were right. Sir, I am going to ask you one more time to please look at my boarding pass and move to your correct seat, she said. Her politeness was a choice, and a quiet warning that it was running out. The businessman finally set down his tablet with an exasperated sigh, his face twisting into an expression of outright resentment. Look, he said, his voice rising, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. I don't have time for this nonsense. I have been flying first class for 30 years. This is my seat. I paid for this seat, and I am not moving for some lost little girl who can't read her ticket properly. The racial implications of his words struck the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped. The woman across the aisle whispered, "How dare he?" The young man with the phone was now openly recording, realizing he was witnessing a moment of blatant prejudice that deserved to be seen. But what the arrogant passenger didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. He had chosen to discriminate against a girl who, while not wealthy, was connected to a network of influence he couldn't possibly comprehend. Amara Johnson was not just any 12-year-old girl. She was a Sharma Foundation scholar, one of the brightest young minds in the country, and she was about to remind this man that a person's worth is not determined by the clothes they wear or the color of their skin. A flight attendant finally appeared, drawn by the rising tension and the small crowd of passengers watching the scene unfold. But instead of immediately defusing the situation by checking the boarding passes, she looked at the impeccably dressed Japanese businessman and then at the young black girl in simple clothes, and her own biases clouded her judgment. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, but her tone was directed at Amara, implying she was the source of the disturbance. The flight attendant's arrival should have been the moment justice prevailed. A simple verification of tickets would have ended the dispute in seconds. But the attendant, a woman in her late 40s named Ms. Davis, had made a snap judgment. In her years of service, she had learned to categorize passengers, and her instincts, steeped in unconscious bias, told her the businessman belonged and the girl did not. "Ma'am," Ms. Davis said to Amara, her voice dripping with the kind of patronizing sweetness reserved for unruly children, "could I please see your boarding pass?" The request itself was standard procedure, but her tone, and the fact that she had only asked Amara while completely ignoring the man's refusal to provide any proof, revealed her prejudice. Amara handed over her pass. The flight attendant examined it with an exaggerated scrutiny, flipping it over as if searching for a hidden flaw. The ticket was, of course, completely legitimate. But instead of immediately rectifying the situation, Ms. Davis hesitated, clearly reluctant to confront the stern-faced businessman on behalf of a child. "This does show seat 2A, she admitted grudgingly. "But there seems to have been a mistake in the system," she then turned to the businessman with a far more respectful, almost apologetic, tone. "Sir, could I possibly trouble you to see your boarding pass?" The businessman scoffed. "I do not need to show you anything," he said dismissively. "My assistant booked this seat. This girl is obviously mistaken. Find her correct seat in the back." His blatant refusal to cooperate should have been a major red flag, but Ms. Davis seemed more intent on placating the aggressive passenger than upholding the rules. "Well," she said weakly, turning back to Amara, "perhaps we could find you another nice seat. I'm sure we can work something out that makes everyone happy." The suggestion was an outrage. Amara had earned this specific seat. It was part of her prize. Now she was being asked to give it up because a prejudiced stranger had decided she wasn't worthy of it. It was the exact kind of quiet injustice her mother had warned her about, the kind that happens when good people fail to act. Before Amara could voice her protest, the businessman escalated the situation, his words sharp and cruel. "You should find a seat that is more appropriate for you," he said with a smirk, his racist intent now crystal clear. "Perhaps one closer to the galley. I'm sure your mother is waiting for you somewhere." The insult, implying she belonged in a service area, hit the cabin like a shockwave. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. The young man recording the incident made a point to zoom in on the man's face. The comment was a vicious throwback to stereotypes about where black people were allowed to be. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others looked on in stunned silence. Their inaction only amplified the hostile environment being created around a 12-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong. Amara felt a fire of righteous anger build inside her. But her mother had taught her that anger was a tool, not a master. It had to be controlled and directed. "Don't let them see you cry," her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Let them see your strength." "Sir," she said, her voice remaining perfectly even despite the abuse she was enduring. "I earned this seat. I belong here. And you still haven't shown anyone your boarding pass." Her words were precise and powerful, delivered with a quiet authority that made several passengers look at her with newfound respect. This was not a confused child, this was a person of substance. But the businessman was too insulated by his own bigotry to see the danger. He doubled down on his prejudice, making comments that would soon be seen by millions. "You earned this," he sneered, his voice dripping with disbelief. "How? Did your school have a fundraiser? Or is this some kind of charity trip?" The implication was clear and vile, a black girl couldn't possibly achieve her way into first class. Her presence had to be the result of a handout. The prejudice was now undeniable. Other passengers began to murmur, their sympathies clearly shifting. The woman across the aisle looked furious. An elderly black man in row 3 shook his head with a look of weary recognition. Faced with an escalating crisis, Ms. Davis, the flight attendant, made the worst possible decision. Instead of enforcing policy and removing the disruptive passenger, she turned on Amara. "Miss," she said, her voice now cold and sharp, "I'm going to have to ask you to either take another seat or leave the aircraft. You are causing a disturbance." The injustice was staggering. Amara, the victim of racial abuse and theft, was now being threatened with removal, while the man who had caused the entire problem faced no repercussions. Several passengers could no longer remain silent. "Are you kidding me?" the woman across the aisle exclaimed, standing up. "He's the one causing a disturbance. He won't show his ticket and he's been making racist remarks to a child." But Ms. Davis had chosen her side. She was aligning herself with the wealthy-looking businessman against the lone black girl, perpetuating the very institutional bias that the airline claimed to oppose. Amara looked around the cabin, at the faces of the people watching this unfold. Some were supportive, others were afraid to get involved, and a few looked away, uncomfortable. But they were all about to learn a powerful lesson. "Ma'am," Amara said to the flight attendant, her voice dropping to a deadly calm, "I think you should be very, very careful about what you do next." There was a weight to her words, a quiet certainty that hinted at consequences far beyond anything Ms. Davis or the arrogant businessman could foresee. But they were too wrapped up in their own prejudices to hear the warning. They had no idea they were discriminating against someone who was about to connect them to a power that could ground their flight, their careers, and expose their bigotry to the entire world. The tension in the first-class cabin was a palpable thing, thick with unspoken anger and the heavy weight of injustice. The businessman, emboldened by the flight attendant's misguided support, decided to press his advantage. He was convinced he was dealing with a lost child who would crumble under pressure. His prejudice had rendered him deaf to the quiet strength in Amara's voice and blind to the dangerous calm in her eyes. "You know what your problem is," he said, standing up to his full height and towering over Amara in a clear act of physical intimidation. Your problem is that your kind always wants something for nothing. You think you are entitled to things you haven't earned. Well, this is the real world, little girl. And in the real world, there are consequences for not knowing your place. The racist language, your kind, your place, was so explicit that no one could pretend to misunderstand his meaning. Several more phones emerged, their small red lights indicating that this moment was being preserved. A woman in row 4 stood up, her face a mask of fury. "Excuse me, but what did you just say to that child? Did you really just tell a little girl to know her place?" The businessman turned on her with the same dismissive arrogance. "Madam, this is not your concern. I am simply trying to restore order by ensuring passengers are seated according to their proper station." The word "station" dripped with a venomous, classist undertone that was impossible to ignore. He was arguing for a world where people were segregated by their perceived status. But Amara Johnson had heard enough. She had been raised by a woman who scrubbed floors and served food with more dignity than this man possessed in his entire being. And her mother had taught her that when you fight for what's right, you are never alone. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, "I think you should sit down and be quiet now." There was a new quality to her tone, an unmistakable note of command that made everyone pause. This was not the voice of a victim. This was the voice of someone who knew the game was about to change. The businessman laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Oh, really? And what are you going to do? Tell your mother the waitress on me? This is the adult world, and we handle things differently." "You're absolutely right," Amara replied, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "Adults do handle things differently. And you're about to find out how." She reached into her simple backpack, a bag that held textbooks and a worn copy of her favorite novel, and pulled out her phone. It was a standard, slightly older model, but in her hands, it was about to become a weapon of justice. "I think it's time I made a phone call," she said calmly. The businessman chuckled again. "Go right ahead. I'm sure someone will be very interested to hear how you tried to steal a first-class seat." Several passengers exchanged nervous glances. There was something in Amara's unflinching confidence that suggested this was not an empty threat. Amara dialed a number from memory, a number she had been told to use only in an emergency. As the phone rang, she looked the businessman directly in the eye, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Hello, Dr. Sharma," she said when the call connected, her voice clear and respectful. "This is Amara Johnson. I am so sorry to bother you, but I have a situation on my flight that I need your help with." The businessman was still smirking, completely oblivious. The flight attendant, however, was beginning to look uneasy, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "I'm on flight 724 to Chicago," Amara continued, relaying the facts with crisp efficiency. "There is a passenger in my assigned seat who refuses to move. He has made several racist comments to me and suggested I don't belong here. The flight attendant has sided with him and threatened to have me removed from the plane for causing a disturbance." She paused, listening to the response on the other end, then looked directly at the businessman. "Your name," she said into the phone. "She's asking for your name." She turned to him. "Sir, could you please tell me your name? The head of my scholarship foundation would like to know who she's dealing with." The man's smirk wavered, but his arrogance held. "Tell her my name is Kenji Tanaka. And tell her I have more important things to do than deal with a misbehaving child." Amara repeated the name into the phone. A moment later, a powerful, clear voice came through the speaker, audible to everyone nearby. What they heard made several of them gasp. "Mr. Kenji Tanaka," the voice said with cold, sharp authority. "This is Dr. Anya Sharma. I want you to listen to me very carefully. You have just made the single greatest miscalculation of your professional career." The businessman's face began to transform as he registered the danger in the voice. This wasn't just some teacher. This was someone else entirely. "My foundation, the Sharma Foundation for Young Innovators, is sponsoring Miss Johnson's trip to the conference," the voice continued. "You may not know me, but your CEO, Mr. Sato of Tanaka Corp., sits on my foundation's board of directors. He is a great champion of the work we do to support brilliant young minds like the one you are currently harassing. The name hit the cabin like a physical blow. Dr. Anya Sharma was a titan of the tech industry, a celebrated philanthropist whose foundation was one of the most prestigious in the world. And Tanaka Corp was a global giant. The man had just been racially abusive to the protégé of his own CEO's close associate. Kenji Tanaka's face went from a confident smirk to ashen horror in less than 3 seconds. The color drained from his features as he finally understood the magnitude of his error. He had been racist to a girl who was directly connected to the highest levels of his own company. The flight attendant looked as if she was about to be physically ill, realizing she had threatened to remove a passenger who was under the personal protection of one of the airline's most valuable corporate clients. But Dr. Sharma was not finished. Furthermore, Mr. Tanaka, her voice continued, now carrying the full weight of her immense influence, the Sharma Foundation has an exclusive corporate travel contract with this airline worth over $50 million a year. That contract is contingent upon our scholars, all of whom come from diverse and often underprivileged backgrounds, being treated with the utmost dignity and respect. What happens next is going to be very simple. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute as Dr. Sharma continued, her voice now on speakerphone for everyone to hear. Every passenger was frozen, listening to a masterclass in how power, when wielded for justice, could change the world in an instant. Mr. Tanaka, Dr. Sharma said, her voice like ice. You need to understand something. Your apology, which I am sure is coming, is irrelevant. You are not sorry for being a racist. You are only sorry you were a racist to a child who has powerful friends. That is a distinction my board and I find unforgivable. Tanaka's transformation from arrogant bully to terrified subordinate was now complete. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands trembled. Dr. Sharma, he stammered, his voice a pathetic whisper. I sincerely apologize. I had no idea. I mean, if I had known. If you had known what? Dr. Sharma cut through his excuse like a razor. That this brilliant young black girl was connected? So your respect is conditional? That is the very definition of bigotry. The flight attendant, Ms. Davis, interjected desperately, trying to save her job. Dr. Sharma, I want to assure you, this was just a simple misunderstanding about seating. A misunderstanding? Dr. Sharma's laugh was devoid of all humor. Miss Johnson showed you her boarding pass. Mr. Tanaka showed you nothing. He was racially abusive, and you threatened to remove the victim. The only thing I misunderstand is how you are still employed. Dr. Sharma then took control of the entire situation. Captain, she said, her voice now projecting a tone of absolute command, this is Dr. Anya Sharma. I am invoking the emergency contact clause in the Sharma Foundation's corporate contract. I need you to halt this aircraft immediately and return to the gate. A moment of stunned silence, and then the captain's voice came over the plane's communication system, tinged with shock. Dr. Sharma, is that you? Sir, we are third in line for takeoff. Is there an emergency? Yes, Captain, there is, Dr. Sharma replied. There is a passenger in first class creating a hostile, racist environment for one of my scholars. There is also a flight attendant who has failed in her duty to protect a child. I need both of them removed from this aircraft immediately. The announcement sent a shockwave through the cabin. Passengers looked at each other in disbelief and dawning satisfaction. A flight was being grounded, not because of a mechanical issue, but because of a moral one. Tanaka made one last, desperate plea. Please, Dr. Sharma, I have a family. A career. I made a terrible mistake. You did not make a mistake, Dr. Sharma's voice overrode him with ruthless clarity. You made a choice. You chose to be cruel to a child because you thought she was powerless. You were wrong. The captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be returning to the gate to resolve a passenger conduct issue. We apologize for the delay. The plane's engines powered down as it slowly began to turn, abandoning its place in the takeoff queue. Tanaka collapsed back into the seat that wasn't his, a broken man. Dr. Sharma's voice filled the cabin one last time, delivering a message meant for everyone. Let me be very clear. My foundation exists to find brilliant minds in places where others are not looking. We exist to break down the very barriers of prejudice that Mr. Tanaka and Ms. Davis have demonstrated today. This isn't just about Amara. This is about every child who has ever been told they don't belong in a room they earned the right to be in. Today, we are making it clear that such behavior has consequences. The plane came to a stop at the gate. Through the windows, everyone could see airport security vehicles and airline executives rushing toward them. Justice was arriving. Amara stood calmly in the aisle, watching as the two adults who had tried to humiliate her realized the full scope of their error. Her mother, the waitress, had taught her about dignity. Today, Dr. Sharma had taught her about power. Together, they were an unstoppable force.